Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Somehow we still have this rain around us this day, but know that in the future, this rain brings us, green grass and beautiful flowers and crops and many other great things. Not just the gloominess of a Friday morning. So um, with the hope of that, the 2024 New Year's resolutions, hope that many of you took a moment to reflect on that. I know one of the simple things that I have been trying to do coming into this new year is just increasing my fruits and vegetables and trying to be more intentional about that. Um, Something simple that hopefully I can hold myself to. So hope that yours are going well this 3 to 4 weeks into January, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. So today we are talking about disaster response with Jane Crady, who is with Catholic Charities. We're excited to have her with us. And disaster response is one of those things that has a few different organizations that specialize in that work, but in truth, it touches all human service organizations in some way or another at some point in time, because we have often encountered individuals who have had some sort of exposure to disaster or have had some sort of interruption or disruption in their lives. So I hope that we can all learn from Jane today. And with that, I will turn it over to Deja. Also, just wanted to give a quick heads up that unfortunately today I have a conflict toward the end of our meeting, so I will not be here to close us out, but wanted to be sure to be here to welcome everyone and to thank you for spending your morning with us, learning together. And I look forward to learning from Jane with you. So Deja, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for welcoming us today. But good morning, everyone, and welcome back and happy 2024. I hope everyone's New Year's is off to a great start. If you have not been here before, I want to introduce myself. My name is Deja Cyrus, and I am the Manager of Organizational Development for our sector support team here at United Way of Central Indiana. So today, we're very excited to have you all join us for a discussion around disaster response and the importance of having it in place at your organization. So this morning we'll hear from Jane Crady, as Sarah said, of the Catholic Charities Archdiocese of Indianapolis. Jane currently serves as the Disaster Preparedness and Response Coordinator and possesses a wealth of knowledge on disaster response, not only in the Central Indiana region, but across the entire state of Indiana. So Jane, I'll let you kick us off here and we'll get the slides pulled up, and we're excited to hear from you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. First of all, I want to apologize. The camera on my computer is kicking in and out, so I've just shut mine off. And so the slides will be coming up in-house over at United Way. In a minute. There we go. Okay, so let's just go through the first part here. Before the disaster hits, the first thing you've got to be sure you've got in place is and set up is your COOP. Okay, next slide, please. As she said, I'm Jane Crady with the Archdiocese of Indianapolis Catholic Charities. I'm the coordinator of disaster response. There's my contact information. If anybody has further questions or would like to ask me or let me help you with something, please just get in touch. Next slide, please. We all know that any time of year, tornadoes hit all over Indiana. Most people don't realize that we had 54 touchdowns in 2023. We had 27 hit down at one time in different places across the state on March the 31st, the night of, into April the 1st, causing serious damage in several counties where we had FEMA declarations. Next slide, please. Next slide. There we go. And of course, we know fire can take Be anywhere at any time at all. Next slide. Just go right through these first ones. And of course, we know winter ice storms can be very brutal. We've been fortunate so far this year. I think up north they've had a little more than we have, but next slide, please. And we're all too familiar with floods in Indiana. That's actually our major disaster hazard here in Indiana is flooding. Next slide. Earthquakes. I'm sure you all know that we're real close to the New Madrid and the Wabash Valley faults, and we've been practicing for years on the response to earthquakes. These could happen here in Indiana. Next slide. But what if the unthinkable happens? We have to prepare, unfortunately, today for this type of disaster also. Next slide. Or what if you get one of these? Next slide, please. So, disaster response or emergency operations plans prepare you to assist your community when a disaster hits. The COOP, and no, it's not a chicken coop after all, it's the Continuity of Operations Plan, which prepares your agency to continue to operate to serve the clients that you serve now before the disaster. Next slide, please. So what is a COOP anyway? The process or plan for recovering the critical organizational infrastructure, okay? So in other words, it's going to deal with your core business functions, provide policies and procedures to do that. It'll identify contingency arrangements. What do we do if we're hit by a disaster? And above all, inform your employees and your volunteers of their role in the plan. Next slide. So the COOP describes how you will keep the essential functions running. It does not describe how your organization is going to service the community. Next slide. These are just some of the COOP buzzwords that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. There's a lot of them, but those are all part of getting your COOP up and running. Next slide. So, first of all, how do you get started? Initiate the plan. You've got to have, of course, leadership, but they're not the designer of the plan. You want a team approach. You want your core staff to be involved in all of this planning and implementation. Next slide. So you develop and manage your plan by doing the draft, training your staff and your volunteers, testing it, and then implementing it. Be clear on what your COOP will be, but especially what it will not be. Again, this is not the plan for how you're going to help the community. This is the plan for how you're going to continue to operate and serve your existing clients. Let's say you have a homeless shelter, a food pantry, whatever it is, you help pay electric bills, whatever it is you do, you need to be sure and understand that your clients that may not have been hit by the disaster are still going to need services. Next slide, please. So what do we include? Your mission statement, of course, and that relates to your agency's mission statement. Your purpose, which describes the purpose of the plan. And the purpose of the plan is basically to be able to continue to serve our clients. The applicability and the scope. And then, of course, you got to do the activation, the decision process. Who does what? Who does what, when, where, and why? Don't forget the why. Especially in a time of chaos following a disaster, it's very important that all the staff and volunteers understand why they're doing it before they have to do it, because it'll make more sense to them. The who, what, and when come together and where once they know why they're doing it. And of course, your leadership succession. Next slide, please. So identify and prioritize your operation. What is it we have to do? assign your staff, outline the procedures, and then set up the critical infrastructure team, human resources. Who's going to be available? What if, in other words, half of Indianapolis is hit, or whatever community you're in, and some of your employees or volunteers cannot get there, or perhaps they're actually affected by the disaster themselves. So you've got to kind of do this in a tiered order so that you have kind of a backup person for each staff or for each function of the plan. Communications, how are we going to contact each other? What if the phone lines are down? What if the internet's down? What if all the power is out? How do we get in touch with each other? Alternate facilities, where else could we go? If this building is hit and badly damaged structurally so that we cannot operate from here, where else could we set up our operations to continue to serve our existing clients? That means you want to try and get it somewhere in a location that your clients can still get to you, or you to them, whichever that should be. Your critical systems, processes, vital records. What about payroll? These things can go on for weeks, months, and even years if the damage is heavy. How do we continue to do those things? Are our vital records backed up in the cloud? Is there a way to get to those records other than the file cabinet sitting in the office that we can no longer get to? Plan for restarting your other functions. So let's say you are I don't know, whatever your XYZ, you have the critical functions that you need to do to operate to help your clients. Let's say you're a homeless shelter. Well, the first is housing for the homeless that you already have in there, right? You normally are able to take new clients, but we may not be able to start that right now because the facility may have been damaged. We may have had to move them to an alternate location, and we can't now take in additional clients. So you may have to make plans for when do we restart these other things that we used to do. Bring it up, the critical to your existing clients functions first before you do anything else there. Next slide, please. The general agency procedures. So crisis intervention for your employees as well as your clients and your volunteers. Crisis intervention. This is a disaster. Everybody is affected by this, whether they were hit or not. They know somebody that was. You may have to provide some crisis intervention to help these people get through the crisis. Contact information with alternate points of contact. Do you have other branches or other offices that you could refer people to, or have them at least call to make the appointment or to find out what's going on? If nothing else, 211 is a good place to get that information posted. All you have to do is get a hold of 211, let them know that you are open for business, but you're at another location, whatever, and people can go, when they go to 211, they can get that information. So if you don't have any other route to go, that's a great way to put it. Above all, your agency evacuation plan, and maybe this should be pushed kind of really to the front. If a disaster is imminent, or if it has already hit, what is the evacuation plan from the building that you operate from, where your employees, volunteers, staff are there? You may even have clients there. You need an evacuation plan for all the different types of disaster. For instance, like I said, floods are the biggest threat in Indiana, but it may not be where you are. It could be tornadoes, snowstorms, major power outages, fires, heaven forbid, bomb threats or shooters. what is that evacuation plan for your employees, staff, and volunteers. And then you want to set up the incident command structure. Who reports to who? Okay, next slide, please. Have an operational checklist for every function that you're going to do. Alternate facility information. Where's that going to be? Planning prior to a disaster, as we do in the field out here with disasters. Emergency management, for instance. When I'm working with different counties, their emergency managers, we always pick at least 3 facilities as possibilities for, like, our volunteer center, our donation center, our headquarters, because what if the first one is hit and we can't go there or we can't get there? You need backups. So you want to put that in your plan ahead of time. What is location 1, 2, 3, if you can do that? Of course, you need maps and evacuation routes, not just from the building, but from the streets. Again, confusion sets in when disasters happen, and people are not clear on, okay, I'm going out the back of the building instead of the front of the building like I normally do, and now I'm confused on what street. How do I get out of here? You need to have maps and evacuation routes. Glossary and definition of acronyms. If you use acronyms, please, please, please be sure that you have a list of those that you give to people that spells them out. I mean, I talked about EOC a while ago. Well, EOC can mean a lot of things, or EOP can mean a lot of things. Even FEMA says, please don't use so many acronyms. Well, of course, they had a list of 73 pages of acronyms when they said that. And 2 years later, they cut back on acronyms, they said, but the list is now 105 pages long. So it's a whole language of its own. If you're going to use acronyms, be sure you're also spelling them out for people. Next slide, please. Some things to consider. Were there visitors on the property at the time of the disaster? You got to have a plan in case they are. How will we communicate if the lines are down? Do we have a list of our vendors, our donors, and their phone numbers, or emails, a way to get a hold of them if we can, once the power comes back up, or we can get to a place where we can use them? By the way, a lot of people don't realize that when the lines are down and you can't call on your cell phone, you can probably still text. Okay, text usually works even when the lines are down. Now, if they're completely down across a wide area, you may not be able to. The other thing that you want to consider on communication is there any way we can have a contact person outside of the disaster area? We actually recommend at least 100 miles away, because of the likelihood of their lines being down. And I can often call from here to Virginia, but I can't call from here to Indianapolis. And I'm sitting in Shelby County, by the way. So that's a thought. If there's a point of contact outside the disaster area, that you could at least set up a system where when people do call your number, they could get some kind of a voicemail or a text message giving the outside number who could give them information. Do we have alternate payment systems in place? Not only to pay our staff and employees, but to pay our vendors. If I'm a food pantry and I have to pay a certain amount to gleaners or whoever, do I have a system in place to do that? Do we have all of our insurance information handy? In other words, is it not just the paper policy in the drawer, but where you can get to it, posted in the cloud where you can get to it? Have we assigned somebody to take photos of the damaged areas? This is very important and one that's often overlooked. As soon as it's safe, someone needs to be taking pictures of every room, every part of the building that has damage, so that your insurance company and or FEMA, again, some agencies don't know that nonprofit organizations are often eligible for FEMA when a disaster hits. Next slide, please. So introduce the draft to your team. Assemble your team, have a tabletop exercise. All right. Maybe use a PowerPoint or at least a facilitator and a note taker. Pose a scenario of a disaster, be it a fire or a tornado or a flood, whatever you think might be the biggest danger to your area or to your location. So what are the immediate steps to take in that, to walk through that scenario? What are the first steps that need to be done? What needs to be done to keep the agency operating? What happens 3 weeks from now, 8 weeks, 6 months, a year out? Do we expect to be back in the building by then or not? Depends on how bad the damage was. What needs to be done right now before the disaster to mitigate the loss and enhance the COOP? To mitigate the loss. I'm sure you all know what mitigate means, but some people get confused on it because it can mean a lot of things. But mitigate is basically simply to prevent or decrease the amount of damage during the disaster. Okay. As I tell people when I'm doing trainings out in the field for those of us who respond actually to the communities, it can be as drastic as putting the building up on stilts to get it above the flood level, or it can be as simple as changing and extending your drain pipe so that the water outside the house doesn't come right down next to the foundation and weaken your foundation, and the foundation basement collapses. So mitigation is just what can we do now that would keep or lessen the damage if we were hit by tornado, flood, whatever. Flood is pretty easy. Getting things up higher, right, is of course the first thing. But think about it. And these are things that in your tabletop exercise that you do with your staff, have them all brainstorm on these things and then incorporate that feedback and discussion into your COOP so that these are the suggestions made. Let's see what we can do with this. Next slide, please. Revise it on a regular schedule. Why? Because you have programmatic changes. We used to do this, we don't do it anymore. We don't need that in there. Or we've added something. Staff changes, and especially volunteer changes, that happens all the time. Contact information changes. Maybe somebody in your staff, their phone numbers changed. Is it there in the COOP? Yeah, it's in your HR, but is it in your COOP where you can readily get a hold of it? Provide necessary documentation to the team. Document activities and debrief with them so that they have the input to see what's going on. Train, introduce the staff to the COOP procedures. Next slide, please. Focus on your core business functions, of course. You want to be sure that you have that inside infrastructure in place, like I said, so that you're able to carry on the business in your office, in your organization. Use the team approach, address the procedures, include testing and maintenance. Test it. Do a run through of it. Be sure that it works. If it doesn't, adjust it. And of course, be sure you're keeping it up to date. That's one of the biggest problems we find when we help people set up COOPs, is a year, 2 years from now, it's in the drawer, it's forgotten. Yeah, we've got 5 new employees and the people that started it are really not around anymore, and it's just there it is. It needs to be, you should do it every 6 months, but at least review it once a year, please. Next slide, please. So take the time to do it right, see it through, and have everybody involved. You want as many involved in this as you possibly can. Do a transparent assessment. Which programs must remain open out of all of the parts of what you do? And many of us do multiple things. I know we have, I believe 7 agencies in Catholic Charities out of Indianapolis alone. Everybody has a separate need and a separate program that must remain open, parts of it. So identify them. Next slide, please. So complete your COOP, test your COOP, manage your COOP. Next slide. So let's talk about the incident command system. ICS, it's a simple system to maintain operations. It's a federal process actually put together by the federal agency NIMS. It's the National Incident Management System. You can go out on FEMA and find that very easily. It's a free course if you want to take it. It's very interesting and very rewarding. It's a framework that's scalable. It can be used from everything from planning a wedding to disasters. Okay. And the good part is with the system, no one person oversees more than 3 to 5 people. In other words, you don't have the person who's in charge seeing 20 people out here that I've got to keep track of. You'll see this in a second. Next slide, please. So your incident commander, or the person in charge, whatever you want to call them, would, as you can see there, they oversee and work directly with the public information officer, the safety officer, we'll talk about these in a second, the finance officer, and the liaison. Under that, then you have the chief operations officer. So the head honcho here is going to work with 5 people. And then under the chief operations officer, you've got different areas. And if you need to take that down farther, you do. But no one person has to oversee more than 3 to 5 people. Okay. Next slide, please. So who is that incident commander? Who should it be? Well, in our normal operations, it's your executive director or your CEO. But it may not need to be that person, and maybe it should not be that person. That the executive director is going to have their hands full with other things at that point in time. All of the operational, paper things that come up when everything's destroyed. How do we get the building redone? You want somebody who is qualified, that has some experience, training, a past history of being able to manage a situation under pressure, because that's what this is going to be. Okay. It might be the guy that's right now the janitor. If this guy has that cool head and organization to be able to put this together and pull things together, that might be who it is. I don't know. You'll have to figure that in your organization, but it's probably not the existing executive director. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. The incident commander, of course, collects the information from everybody, makes the final decisions. The safety officer is the person who's responsible for the safety of the staff and the volunteers. They identify mitigation procedures. Okay. The finance, that's pretty clear. They track all the expenses, manages the money and donations if donations start coming in. Next slide, please. Your public information officer is who's going to, like I said, maybe contact 211 and give that information and be sure it's up to date. They're the one that's going to let the news know that, yes, we've been hit, but we're still working, etc. The liaison is responsible for finding any outside help that you might need. Let's say, for instance, you're a food pantry and Gleaners is hit. Okay, so what do we do now? How do we find that extra help that we need to keep supplying our people? They're going to work very closely with the public information officer. Next slide, please. The operations chief is the one that's going to oversee all the disaster response operations, cleanup crews. They're the ones in charge of getting your building put back together and the long-term part of that. Logistics manages the ordering and tracking of all the materials and supplies, just like they do now, but they need to identify, in the case of a disaster, what else do we need now? And how do I find that? And how do I pull that together? Next slide, please. And of course, planning. That could be combined with logistics. They're responsible for pre-positioning supplies, especially your disaster supplies, supporting the operations chief, and determine what's needed and when it should arrive. Next slide, please. Case management. Many of you do case management for your own organizations, for your clients, but during a disaster, I'm thinking here because I don't want to confuse this. The immediate case management needed by you is for your employees, your regular volunteers, and your clients, okay? You're going to hear about people doing case management all over the disaster area. It's a whole separate thing. Focus on the case management of your employees and volunteers and your existing clients, those that existed before the disaster, the things you do right now. Why do you need to do case management for employees and volunteers? Well, again, number one, they may need some emotional and spiritual care. They may have been hit by the disaster at their home. They may have family and friends crisis counseling, whatever it is. The same with your clients. Now, the difference is you're going to stop there. You're going to get with the case management. You're going to gather the information, all right? And then you're going to turn it over to the people who will be doing the long-term recovery work. So let's take, for example, that 3 of your employees, their homes were actually hit hard by the tornado that came through. Gather all their information, get everything you can. What's their old address? I mean, the one that was hit. Where are they staying now? How do we get in touch with them? Is there an alternate phone number? How bad was the damage? Is anybody hurt? Did they have anybody disabled in their home? Did they have any elderly in their home? Are any of them veterans? And I'm asking that because there are other benefits available there. Get that information, and then you're going to turn it over to the long-term recovery group that gets set up when a disaster happens in a community. The long-term recovery group will have disaster case managers for anyone who is affected by the disaster. By the way, I train those people too. So if anybody, that's a full 2-day and sometimes 3-day training. If anybody's interested in becoming a long-term recovery disaster case manager, get in touch with me. I try and do several of those a year and always do a lot of them when we have disaster locations. But you're going to just give that information to those case managers who will then connect them with FEMA if we have a FEMA declaration, SBA, the Small Business Administration's disaster funds, what we call the SDRF, State Disaster Relief Funds, and the community resources. Their goal is to help get them back as close to their normal as we can possibly do, get them back in their homes and or relocated, and make sure everything is on track for them. So you don't need to worry about how do we help my client rebuild their house? I mean, outside of maybe taking up an office collection. Same thing for your clients. Be sure that, when your clients do come in or get in touch, were you hit? Where are you living now? What's going on? We can turn you over to people who can get you help. Okay. So you don't need to worry about being familiar with the resources of FEMA or the sequence of delivery, by the way, that they changed yesterday. But you don't need to worry about all that because you're going to get the whatever. Why does that say A and A? I have no idea. But those are the 2 points, your employees and your clients, and start a file on each of them and then give that information to the long-term recovery disaster case managers. Okay. Next slide, please. This is just a revisit of what the incident command system looks like. And again, just go to FEMA, Google FEMA, and you can put in NIMS or incident command system, and it'll bring it right up for you. Next slide, please. So who covers these positions? We talked about a lot of people there and a lot of work and a lot of responsibility. It depends on the size of your agency, your organization. Some people have to wear many, many hats. That's all there is to it. Okay. As a disaster wears on, you may have to switch positions out. People get tired. I mean, if this drags on for 3 months, 6 months, a year, that you're not in the same building and things are still crazy, hopefully better than they were, but you may have to switch positions out. Okay. So rotate if necessary. And then once your feet are on the ground and you're operating smoothly with your normal clients, that's pre-disaster clients, then consider responding to the community. Okay. We do see that in some organizations, when a disaster hits, oh my gosh, they respond to the disaster and they neglect their existing clients. Don't do that. This is to get you to keep those people on an even keel, keep serving your clients, and then you can look about what else can we do to help the community. I'm open for questions. That's all I've got. The slides can be made available to you, I believe. And if you have questions or any further information that I can help you with, feel free to call, email, or get in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. And at this time, we want to open the call for any Q&A, any questions anyone has. Please feel free to come off of mute as your questions arise, or if you want to put them in the chat box, we can do it there. But I definitely want to open up some time and allow some time for questions.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, hi, Jane. Thanks so much for that. I'm curious, in your experience, I know you go all over the state and help with disasters. How often do you see organizations that have actually done this planning, and what's the impact? What difference do you see with nonprofits specifically who have a plan versus those that don't?
Well, unfortunately, Julie, I see a lot of them that don't, or maybe that they think they do, but it's so old that they haven't reviewed it in years. And like I said, people change, situations change. It's frustrating. I think more businesses, have plans, uh, because they focus on, how's my business carry on? Unfortunately, we in the nonprofit world often don't think about this so much. We think, how can we help everybody? How can we help? But what if we're hit? So I don't know. I would not say 50% at the most of the ones I've run into at any rate. It's kind of a sad situation that I think we need to push. I see a hand up.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. This was a great presentation. Thanks, Jane, for doing this. Having done several of these in the hospital and in government, it gets really overwhelming. And sometimes people want to meet and go over it and over it and over it. And every time they address one part, they uncover something else, and then they get really overwhelmed and they have to bring in more people. And sometimes it becomes a really long, drawn out process. So I always encourage people, just start simple, start with what you have, and at least get that in place. And then as you need to add more, just keep adding onto your COOP plan so that it is eventually complete. And the one area people really take for granted is if the IT system that you have in place goes down, and having some type of backup support and practicing what downtime looks like. That is probably the most stressful to think about, because you can think about how to get out of the building, how to get to somewhere safe, how to find out who your people are. But that infrastructure piece, that technology brings us, is the most stressful to think about if it goes down. So just echoing what Jane shared during her presentation, it's just really important that you get together and at least get it started. And Jane's being nice. I wasn't going to even think 50%. I was thinking it was less than that. So Jane, you're very gracious.
Thanks, Terry. And those are great points. I'm glad you added those. But I may be, I deal with disaster people most of the time. So yeah, you've probably got a better handle on that than I have. Like I said, 50% at the most, I'm sure. Thanks, Terry. We can't hear you, dear.
Sorry. Clark, I see that your hand is up, so you can fire away with your question.
Not so much a question, I guess, is additional sharing that your comments today sparked. First of all, thank you. We have an emergency crisis plan, but it doesn't include enough on the physical disaster type of emergency planning that you're talking today. So that is further work we need to do. But what I wanted to share was even small things. We do fire drills twice a month, and I was pointing out to people that everybody gets so used to those that I took a small poll, and everybody's keys, cell phones, and laptops were still in the building. And if this was a real fire, we may not be able to get back in ever. And that's just a disaster right there, and something as simple as a fire. So you could find some opportunities to get some people's attention to start some planning, even around something as simple as that. On a larger scale, I'll share from a national conference that I went to how important this kind of planning is, not so well for physical disasters, like Jane was sharing really well today, but also the example that they shared was having an emergency crisis plan. But one of the important things is an early decision point of whether the plan would be activated or not. And the example that they shared from their real experience was a program leader was murdered in the parking lot of your nonprofit. That's not going to activate the emergency crisis plan. A week later, a client was arrested and confessed to the murder. That also was not going to trigger the emergency crisis plan. But in the confession, it was discovered that there was a major financial fraud related to one of the government-funded programs that leader was managing. That triggered the emergency crisis plan. So things like communication was important. And the advice that they also shared was splitting your leadership and board leadership in two. That crisis would have a life of its own. And Jane's examples too, if it's a large enough crisis, that's going to have a life of its own, while you need a other leadership team to also make sure you're running the major operation or the regular core operations. The other two quick things to share was how important that communication is, whether it's a physical disaster or if there's some major crisis type of communication thing. And then related to communication, both if it's a physical disaster or if it's a kind of a scandalous type of emergency crisis, an early decision point of whether a lawyer needs to be involved quickly, because that can protect all the communication and emailing and files. So those were some early decision points that they shared, and I just want to share that with the group.
Thanks a lot. That was good information, Clark.
Yes, very helpful. Thank you, Clark. Terry, you as well. These are really useful insights. Do we have any other questions? Anybody want to ask anything? Come off mute and ask anything, or any questions that we want to place in the chat? Well, Jane, one of my questions to you, how would you recommend that organizations build a culture of preparedness? Like, where would you recommend they begin? I know we talked about a few resources, but if a nonprofit organization specifically didn't have anything in place, and they have something like of a culture around there never being a disaster preparedness plan, where would you recommend they begin?
That's an interesting question, because what I find in the disaster world, even in communities where tornadoes touch down, I spend a lot of time training people in all over the state, actually. And we find that organizations, even counties, uh, government officials, unless they've been hit by the disaster, they don't think it's going to happen. It's on the back burner. So it's a tough one when there's no disaster in the area. You may be able to point to a disaster nearby and say, look, I don't know if you know this, but those 54 tornadoes that touched down in 2023 could have hit us. They came right around us and did not, we were very fortunate, but we've got to get started here, that kind of thing, because that is the big problem. I mean, if people don't are not affected, they don't think it's going to happen. I had somebody tell me one time, I've lived in this county for 50 years and we've never had a tornado. Well, they're one of the very few counties in Indiana that never had a tornado. But, so I think it's just talking about their own safety. And you might start, like, I think was it Clark that talked about fire drills? Something as simple as that, something that, there are a lot of fires all over the place all the time. And unfortunately, there are more than it seems like this winter, we've had a lot of them. Use it as an example and say, we need to start looking at this. What else could happen? What else could we get hit by? If it's not a fire, what else? Do you think that tornado? What if that tornado had hit us? Clark also reminded me of something I should have mentioned, and I recommend that every employee or anybody who spends any time in the building, not your clients, have a bug out bag. He mentioned the keys, the phones, everything were left behind in the building during a fire drill. Have some kind of a little something you can grab. I understand with ladies, that's your purse, but with guys, it's a little harder. Where do I keep that? The minute something happens, that stuff goes right in that bag and go. The other thing that I recommend is, if possible, under your desk or in a locker or wherever you keep them, is a shelter in place bag. Okay. Some bottles of water, some energy bars, some blanket, maybe even a change of clothes in your own shelter in place bag, because you may get caught in the building. I mean, that can happen even if there's not a natural or a man-made disaster in your building. But what if there's something going on in downtown Indianapolis and they shut things down? Everybody has to stay in the building until we find this shooter or this whatever it is. You may need some things that you wish you had. Those are just, as he said, this can go on and on and on and on, and you can just go from one to the next. Pick your battles. Okay. Start with, that's why you want to sit down with a group of your staff and say, okay, let's look at what could happen here. What are our highest risks? In Indiana, the high risk is flood, but maybe we're not in an area where that is likely. Okay. It's not a flood area where I am. So it might be tornado, but it might be fire. Of course, the technological, the IT stuff, of course. Sit down and start looking at that together and then put it out. It's like they say, sell the sizzle, not the steak. All right. When you see somebody advertising, a restaurant, they don't show you a raw steak there. They show you, man, that looks really good, right? Make it right for your staff. Let's talk about your safety in case something should happen.
I think Jane would agree, like in the planning, it won't be the disaster you're planning for. It'll be something
Right.
like it. So whether it's a physical, disaster, flooding, or the kind of the scandalous thing example I was sharing, or the other one is for many of us, we're surrounded by industrial companies. It usually could be a chemical accident, or if you're near a rail line, it could be one tank car away from a spill. It could be anything like that. It's just, she's encouraging us to have a framework to think about it, that you can at least pull something off the shelf or have a copy at home plus at work to begin those calling trees or that process, because you don't know how it would hit. It's just some preparatory framework that would help both board leadership and staff leadership. And some of the staff board leadership may be not alive, depending on one of those crises too. So you have to factor that in as well.
That's right. And I mean, in other words, we're doing all hazard planning here. It's the overall, and then break it down into, what if a fire? What if it's an earthquake? I mean, we've been practicing with Homeland Security for years now because they say that they're expecting the new Madrid fault Wabash to, trigger anywhere between now and, well, it's probably down to 20 years now. So that sounds like a long time away, but it's not. So you want all hazard planning, like what I said, pick your battle here and start somewhere. You can always add to the plan as you go. In other words, while your fire drill works for fires, it doesn't work for tornadoes. You don't want everybody running out of the building. Okay. Or an earthquake. All right. So,
Or a chemical spill.
or a chemical spill. Yes. I mean, look at Richmond, Indiana, and what happened with that chemical fire over there this last year.
For sure. Well, thank you
Yeah.
so much, Jane. Great information, very useful. We really appreciate your expertise, and Clark, and Terry, your additional feedback is our additional great perspectives to have. Now I would like to open the floor up to Ellen Rosenthal to give us a brief, rundown and description and talk a little bit about executive volunteer services.
Good morning. Hi, that was great information. And I'm not going to take much of your time. I just wanted to tell you about another program of United Way that offers support to accredited organizations and other nonprofits in the city. It's called Executive Volunteer Service. It's been going for 13 years. It comprises a team of mostly retired, but some working executives to help nonprofits pro bono in a variety of areas, including board development, executive director and board chair mentoring. We run a peer group. We offer financial management advice, fundraising, human resources management and policies, and a lot of completing strategic plan, helping organizations complete strategic plans. Our mission is to improve nonprofits' ability to serve the community. And I can't speak highly enough about the volunteers who are giving their time. People who have been head of fundraising at nonprofits in the area, a lawyer who has also worked in fundraising and then was an executive director of a nonprofit, a senior VP of human resources for JP Morgan nationwide. These are very talented people who are willing to give their time to help you. So if you're interested in accessing our services, you just need to reach out to me. Isaac Mervis has my information, but I also can be reached at emrosenthal2002@gmail.com. Maybe I can put that in the chat. And if you know of anybody who is interested in volunteering, who has something to offer to the community, I've found that we've really been able to turn boards around, to help develop fundraising plans, and done a lot of helping organizations quickly, effectively get through strategic planning. So I'm open to any questions. I know and I'm happy to talk at future meetings in a little more detail.
Ellen, it looks like Tiffany in the chat said, does a nonprofit have to be a United Way partner to receive help from executive EVS?
No, we are primarily interested in the human services area, but it does actually, the organizations that we're helping now primarily are not United Way partners, but we do help quite a few, family to family. I don't know all the United, Teen Works. We've done a lot of work for United Way partners as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ellen. And thank you everyone for joining the call. If there are any topics that you would like to hear more about on these sector check-in calls, please send me an email. My contact information or the contact information for our sector support team should be included in the meeting invitation that's on your calendar hold. So if you have any recommendations, topics that are important to you right now that you want to learn more about, please shoot us an email with your recommendation. For anyone who is interested in learning a little bit more, our Nonprofit Learning Center is currently active right now with sessions every Tuesday on topics that are related to the nonprofit industry and the human service sector as well. I believe, yes, we just dropped a link in the chat, so please feel free to take a look at some of the curriculum we have laid out for you guys. There is a lot of relevant information there and some really great facilitators for those sessions. So take a look at that, register, it's free, but we are 1 minute over time. So I want to thank you guys for being here today, and I will see you next month.